Right. Welcome everybody to this afternoon's session. I'm firstly greeting everybody online, those who have joined the Zoom webinar, and those who are here in the room. It's really nice to be here, and for those who are online, we wish you were here. My name is Ruth Hall. I'm from PLAS at the University of the Western Cape in Cape Town, and very pleased and honored to be chairing this session where we are discussing and launching two really important books. In the same way a village celebrates when a child is born, we as an intellectual community celebrate every book. And it's a great excitement to have several of the authors and editors of these two books here with us today. We will be discussing them in turn, hearing the story of these books, how they evolved, and what it is that they contribute to the ongoing debates that we are having around agrarian struggles in the South, around the dynamics globally of accumulation within food regimes and food systems. And so the two books we'll be discussing are The Phantom of Upgrading in Agricultural Supply Chains. We will be hearing from one of the two editors of the book, Ismail Karatepe. His co-editor, Christoph Scherer, is not with us today. This is a cross-country cross-crop comparison of smallholders. It's a significant book with 5 detailed case studies and then 3 chapters that provide more of a theorization. So this will be the first, and the second is this very beautiful book, Farming and Working Under Contract, Peasants and Workers in Global Agricultural Value Systems. The 4 co-editors are all here, so I'm sure that this event will be used for some celebratory joint photos with the editors and several of the contributors. Those are Pravin Jha, Paris Yaros, Walter Chambati, and Frida Mazwi. This is a very substantial book with 19 significant chapters organized under several thematic headings. So one of the first thoughts that I had was an interesting contrast in the titles, or the title of one book and the subtitle of the other. Whereas Ismail's book, if I can call it that, The Phantom of Upgrading in Agricultural Supply Chains, uses the notion of chains, and the subtitle of the Jha et al. Book is Peasants and Workers in Global Agricultural Value Systems. So we have value chains and value systems, which I think is very significant. Firstly, the idea of chains as being where value is produced rather than where value is appropriated. Also, chains often is critiqued as ignoring the social embeddedness of food systems. And the term upgrading was also interesting to me, coming from South Africa, where the question around a restructuring of agrarian social relations has long been hotly debated. This idea of emerging commercial farmers has been eternally used as a justification for the deferment of significant redistribution. The idea that farmers will emerge over time into some kind of preordained form of capitalist agriculture linked to global markets. I remember once interviewing a former director of the Land Bank who says, what are these emerging farmers? Emerging from where to what? These are like chrysalises that never hatch. Yeah. So I think that what's exciting about these books is that my sense, and I did receive them last night, but I'm whizzing through, as we all will, and then spend many years thinking about it more deeply. The point is that both of these books, I think, beg the question about how the objectives of agricultural development interventions are defined, and the extent to which mainstream development narratives equate development to forms of social differentiation and accumulation, and often the incorporation of marginal people in peripheral economies into extended transnational and corporately dominated supply chains. I'm going to start off now by inviting Ismail to come. He's going to give us a presentation. And then after that, I'll hand over to Praveen. And in each, I want to sort of ask you, as we go along, either in your initial input or in conversation, we want to know the story of the book. Every book has a story. Tell us the story. What was the drive? What was the spark? Sometimes books are driven not by an enthusiasm that we have an answer, but an outrage and an anger at a flawed set of ideas out there. So what were you responding to? Secondly, who did the work, where, how, and why were those places and cases chosen? And obviously, we want to know your findings, not only the headline findings. Often in a book, what gets submerged in the summary of findings, even in a conclusion chapter or in an editor's introduction, are some of the contradictions and perhaps even enigmatic findings, the things that can't be explained, weren't expected. And sometimes the key research questions of a book evolve over time. Did your questions change? And then perhaps in wider conversation as we move forward, we can reflect on the ways in which these books shift our thinking and what are the next questions. So with that, thank you very much. Ismail, over to you. For those online who haven't all had the chance to engage with everyone here, I hope you've met Ismail from the University of Kassel. I'm sure his profile is up on the invitation. So you can introduce yourself further if you wish.
Thank you. I'm Ismail Karatepe from University of Kassel, from Germany. I'm first of all glad to be here. You are quite right. I mean, each and every book has a story, and the story of this book actually began here. Then the very first meeting of this book actually took place 4 years ago in one of these small rooms in this hotel. So I have a little presentation. Please stop me if I take too much time, because you know, Germany has a tradition of long lectures. Okay. Let me first share my screen. Well, as I said, the story actually began here, exactly 5 years ago. Well, I mean, time flies. This is, well, I mean, even though we appear as editor, I should admit that it's pretty much a collective action. Collective action of those who officially contributed this book, but also the others who commented on different chapters of this book, because we presented our findings in different conferences, also here in 2019. And it's always good to get, you know, feedback, revisions, or comments like, hey, Ismail, it doesn't make sense. It always helps to revise a book, and then I think it's a real intellectual challenge. Again, we have officially 18 contributors. I said officially because, as I said, I mean, there are many others who actually contributed this book with comments and with feedbacks. This book basically covered 6 countries in the south, in the agrarian south, covered 3 crops, and then we had 12 field researchers in the rural areas of global value chain. We have one particular question. The question is, under which circumstances can smallholders and farm workers benefit from the value chain? This is one of the driving question. And the second question is, what's the relationship between economic and social upgrading? Why we basically choose this question? This is one of your questions, because there's a bulk of literature out there saying that one of the way for smallholders is to engage in what is called global value chain. So they enjoy more gain generated across the chain. So this is the way how they see then how they actually then see better working conditions, better gains for them. And one of our sub-question is the relationship between economic and social upgrading. Most of the international organizations and several prominent scholars in this field highlight one particular fact. Again, smallholders should engage the value chain, and then they will earn more exporting to end markets, high-end markets. For the farm workers, it's repeatedly underlined. It's repeatedly underlined that if big farmers, if the large farmers actually then economically upgrade, that will trickle down to the farm workers. So that was more or less the discourse that are repeatedly reproduced, recontextualized in academia as well as in official reports. So, so that's why we choose these two questions, whether it's really the case, or whether we should then a little bit tease out whether really smallholders and farm workers can benefit from the value chain. If they can, under which circumstances? So that was more or less our starting point. Again, we choose 3 crops in the rural areas of Brazil, Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, Colombia, as well as Vietnam, and I shouldn't forget Ghana. And we basically choose 3 crops that have different characteristics. So it let us actually then evaluate the effects of the crop, also the effects of the national and regulations. It allows us to see also the effects of end markets on smallholders as well as on farm workers. If we look at coffee and mango and rice, we can see huge differences. I mean, just I will state the obvious. Then mango has high perishability. Coffee actually brings generally a foreign exchange, and rice has very important nutrition. I mean, has a nutrition importance. And if we look at coffee, it's mostly international. You know, it's mostly exported. Coffee is one of the most exported products after oil. And for mango and rice, it's basically consumed domestically. Well, of course, I mean, if you think about basmati rice in India, well, it's mostly for the export market. And we try to find out in this book with all our researchers the effects of the crop. And perishability is quite an important aspect, because we found out that perishability basically decreases bargaining power of those who cannot wait. Just an example, I mean, mango producers in Brazil, our colleagues found out that they cannot bargain a lot, because once they harvest, they have to sell immediately. And as for rice and coffee, again, they have very important nutrition importance, and then coffee is a source of foreign exchange. And then we have seen fierce political intervention around these 2 products. Mechanization is also a question for us, because mechanization generally means skilled worker, and skilled worker means generally better contract for the workers. And then we also try to find out whether end market matters, but let me put it in advance. end markets generally doesn't bring about any drastic change in the working conditions of farm workers or the conditions of the smallholders in general. So one of these findings is, I mean, the main findings, the things that we underline in all those chapters. The initial question was whether economic upgrading leads to social upgrading. Our finding is, I think, quite clear. We try to show that first, it's empirically invalid. We found no evidence for that. We found no evidence for trickle down. The idea is that large farmers actually then export to European market, so the gain will trickle down to the workers. Our answer is no. We didn't find any trickle down effect. So, but we didn't stop here. We also a little bit deconstruct this belief, and we underline that it's also theoretically quite weak. I mean, there are several reasons, but one obvious reason is, I mean, there is no guarantee that a gain that is generated along with value chain will be shared equally between workers, managers, and owners. Well, owners and managers generally get more. But what we also highlighted, this idea is also ideologically quite strong, because, as I said, it is repeatedly, I mean, this idea is repeatedly re-articulated and recontextualized in different reports, in different academic papers, in different speech, in different policy papers. It shows that it's quite a strong discourse. I think there are two reasons for that. One of them is it's politically pretty much disempowering. What we know that the decent work deficit in the rural areas is done by men and can be basically undone by men. Let me put it in that way. But then leaving these working conditions to the market, I think is pretty much politically disempowering, saying that, okay, let's wait for better gain, for better working conditions. And of course, such a discourse from our perspective also serves the interest those who benefit from the power asymmetry. Those large farm owners, those big coffee producers, actually are the ones who basically reproduces and recontextualizes such academic discourse. What we also underline is the state's role in social upgrading. One of your questions is what actually triggers you to write a very lengthy introduction and a very lengthy conclusion. I mean, when we look at the literature, there is a bulk of literature actually judging the power of the private governance, whether certification works or not, whether fair trade certification, whether green alliance certification. There are many papers. Some papers says yes, they work under certain circumstances. Some papers, some academic works say no, but there's a certain emphasis on that. But our finding rather highlights the importance of the state in social upgrading. By the way, by saying social upgrading, I'm referring to decent work. Social upgrading means, from our point of view, is reducing decent work deficit. And again, there's a bulk of literature out of there saying that, hey, in order to reduce the decent work deficit, we should then expand private governance as much as we can. But our findings say the other way around, because we couldn't actually find any plausible impact on the working conditions, especially as insofar as our case study covers, I mean, I'm pretty sure that there are many other case studies or field works that may have other findings. But what we found out is the importance of the state. Well, let me state the obvious. I mean, labor laws, enforcement capacity of the state, or the state as an employer are all crucial for upgrading processes. But what we also underline that we are talking about the capitalist state. I mean, Praveen just warned us 2 days ago we shouldn't forget the basics. And then one of the basics is that we are talking about capitalist state, and the capitalist state is an unequal terrain, meaning that agricultural workers and smallholders always face difficulties in pursuing their agenda. They are pretty much disorganized. They are pretty much disorganized. They have really less associational power. They cannot impose their own agenda. But on the other end, those who are more powerful in the value chain, they are more organized. They have their association. They are funding universities. They are funding for papers, and so on and so forth. And then we underline that agricultural workers and smallholders are pretty much underprivileged in pursuing their agenda at the very state level. So one of the findings or one of the conclusions that we underline is that they need to mobilize various power resources in the pursuit of social upgrading, meaning that they have to then at some point act collectively and increase their discursive, associational, and structural power in order to decrease decent work deficit in the rural areas of agricultural value chain. In this presentation, also, we just talked yesterday, and then I would like to a little bit talk about what can be done in the further research. I think it will be also a great idea to talk that. I mean, if again the literature in the agricultural value chain pretty much highlight the facilitating role of the state. So basically, state should encourage smallholders to engage into the global value chain. So state has some sort of a role, should have a role that help smallholders to articulate into what's called value chain. But when it comes to the social upgrading, I think we shouldn't forget that state might act as an also regulator. And since 3 days, I have heard a lot of presentation about the procurement. So state act as also buyer, and then in agriculture, it's very rare, but state can act also as a producer, and those aspects actually can be studied to discuss social upgrading via state backing. I have some few examples, but I'm going to skip that in order to give more room for the discussion. Let me come to the very first sentence, why we use the term value chain. There are many competing terms. I mean, supply chain is a term in order to show the logistical chain. Value chain generally captures who gains what from the value chain. In order to capture institutions, and if you would like to in a more contextual way, agricultural value systems and global production network can be used, I guess, in order to scandalize the exploitation and the appalling working condition. Exploitation chains can be also implemented. I think it's all up to what you would like to aim at. You know, what's the aim of your book? And in this book, we would like to show who gets what. You know, which actor gets what. That's why we use the term value chain. It's not an intellectual choice. It's more of a practical choice. And to end the story of this book is basically, again, as I said, it's a product of collective action. You know, so there are several contributors, but also it's a combination of previous research that I am not involved. You know, in the framework of International Center of Development and Dissenberg's other projects. For instance, CAPS project that Praveen and other friends here were pretty much involved. And in this line, there were also other books that were published. And then we basically use also this knowledge pretty much in order to complete this book. I think I answered more or less what your questions. I think I didn't miss anything. Yeah, thank you very much. And then I'm look forward to having that discussion.
Thank you so much. And because of the significant articulation and connections across these two books, I'm going to suggest that we hold our comments and questions. But I'm going to pause for a moment, in case you need that, and ask us all just to note, because, you know, sometimes by the time Praveen has finished, we will have forgotten our burning questions for you, and then you will get off lightly. So let's make sure that doesn't happen. So let's just pause for a moment, and everyone, even if it's a reflection for yourself or a comment or a question to Ismail, let's just pause for a moment and just think about anything that we feel should be noted, or even something that we might be looking out for in Praveen's input. While you're doing that, I want to throw in a few of mine, because that was just the starting set of questions. Okay. Yes, yeah. The first is a very quick question that I think we should often ask. Who funded the research?
Oh, yeah. That's a good question.
Secondly, when you talked about these variables like perishability, mechanization, foreign exchange, market destination, there were two things that I wasn't hearing. One was about labor and the labor demand of these different crops under particular institutional and technological and perhaps agroecological conditions. And the second is, I noticed the crops you chose were not flex crops, crops that can flex between food and fuel. And I would imagine that there might be quite different dynamics. I wonder if that was thought of. Thirdly, while you said that economic upgrading doesn't lead to social upgrading, fair, no trickle-down effect evident. But I'm wondering how you're defining economic upgrading. Is your very definition of economic upgrading incorporation into extended supply chains? In which case, perhaps upgrading is there not the word. Yeah. And in your question around what determines distribution of value of shares, distribution of value is clearly not the amount of value added, but power within that value system. So I was interested in this definition. So thank you very much for that. And let's continue the debate. We're going to be moving on to the second book. And in it, one of the points of connection, I thought, was about the extent to which development is defined as contribution in terms of aggregate output, value at destination market rather than at farm gate prices, and contribution to economic growth in aggregate, rather than questions of resilience or distribution. So it matters what our criteria are here. And one very sort of two contexts came to mind, recent kinds of contexts in which crises have precipitated debate about precisely these things. And the first was, and I'm sure we all have a recollection of the debates in maybe the second and third quarters of 2020, during the first period of the COVID crackdown, where even for the most hardened neoliberal pro-market advocate, it was clear that reliance on global supply chains was what was underpinning massive food system crisis around the world, right? And yet, and amidst this, many countries were talking about export bans, about reinstating systems of securing national grain stocks. You know, these kinds of options were being put back on the table. And there was a doubling down by international financial institutions advocating the most important thing you must do at this point is to open up and keep the global system moving, right? So it was absolutely the imperative of defending the ideological position at that time. The second was actually last year, amidst some of the outcomes of war in Ukraine, and we're not debating the war, we're talking about the effects. There was an evaluation that Steve Wiggins at ODI was involved with, looking at how different, sorry, it might sound bad. Oh, we're just stopping sharing. Yeah, thank you. Looking at how different African agricultural economies were being affected by the outcomes of war in Ukraine, both the interruption of grain supplies, but also inputs like fertilizer. And the two contrasting examples they drew were Kenya and Mali, that Kenya was hugely exposed and was suffering enormous costs as a result, versus Mali. And I remember them sort of presenting this as a strange anomaly, because Kenya is this darling that's adopted these market principles. Mali, you know, outlier. And Mamadou Goïta was in the session and he said, well, yes, obviously. I mean, the point is, here's a well-defended national market with agricultural and, agroecological production methods and limited dependence on external products. So all of those sort of brought to mind some of the sort of recent ways in which these debates have been acted out. So this next book, of course, even the title, Farming and Working Under Contract, consciously draws to mind the 1984 book by Peter Little and Mike Watts, Living Under Contract. And quite a lot of work has been done in recent years, particularly by the Journal of Agrarian Change crowd around this. Much of it, I suspect, sparked by some of the similar focus, the renewed focus on contract farming as a means of connecting smallholders into global supply chains. And I'm sure that all of us are aware of the ways in which the discourse as to the win-win benefits of integration into such supply chains has been mobilized and even weaponized in a fight-back justification of land grabs over the past 10 to 15 years. So I haven't read the book, got it last night, and it is so beautiful. I can only expect that it's not cheap. But it is even better. We like cheap books, and because I think that both of these books lend themselves to incorporation into curricula. So that'll be great. Praveen, over to you. Thanks.
So you posed some questions to SMAIAS, but I was wondering whether others want to do it right away, or and then you can
Let's pause it. Okay. We had a pause. You've written down some comments.
Yeah, so you can just, and then you can sort of.
Yeah. We can go back and forth.
Yes. So, thank you very much, Ruth, for setting the tone so well for the launch of both these books and a whole range of issues which are central from the point of view of well-being of the overwhelming majority of the masses. Because agriculture, as you know, at the global level, we are talking of the single largest abode of living and being, livelihoods, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, I think some of the very important issues which you have flagged are very, very important. Now, before I come to the book and the context of it and etc., I want to draw your attention to the debates and discussions which started in 1980s around these concepts like value chains, commodity chains, supply chains, subsequently moving to something called global production network. At some point, we thought it would be better to move to a different expression conceptually and so on. So broadly, if you look at the literature from late 1960s and 70s, you find that much of the work on what was being talked about as supply chains, value chains, etc., actually was happening in the management schools. It starts from there. As only subsequently that it moves to various social science disciplines and so on. Much of it was being done by scholars who were either unaware of or not interested in Marxian political economy or political economy in general, or ideologically very strongly opposed to it. Right? Now, I'm trying to sort of initiate a conversation almost in a telegraphic manner. We are not getting into lots of details, which are indeed very important. So, in roughly, let's say, about 20 years or so since the modern discussions, post Second World War discussion, etc., on these things have started, by 1980s, you start finding that a number of scholars trained and tuned to political economy traditions start engaging with it in a manner which is very critical of the literature that had been produced for the first 20 years. Yeah. For sake of simplicity, let me just put it into two categories broadly, the literature that we have. One, I call the managerial paradigm. Yeah. Jeffrey is a very good exponent of that. Yeah. It's a kind of sort of much celebrated scholar who heads that brigade. Yeah. He has a primer on value chains, commodity chains. That primer keeps getting revised. And so if you look at last several years, and there, if you just look at the first page of the primer, in every edition of it, it is claimed that this is the best thing that has happened for developing countries. And it's not a question of not being part of it, but the real question is how to become a part of it. How do you create capacities and so on and so forth? Poverty, unemployment, everything that you have in the developing world, none of these can be addressed without getting integrated into value chains and so on. Right? So he puts it very, very forcefully and so on. So this is the condition for improvement in the lives of the people, doing away with poverty, doing away with unemployment, etc., in global south. That's the kind of basic claim which is there. And then he talks of many aspects, many dimensions of it. Let's not get into those, because I just want to remain focused on the key issues that is important for us to flag here as part of that conceptual terrain. On the other hand, you had, as I said, from 1980s, more and more people sort of looking at all this in a much more critical fashion, the kind of issues that SMAIAS was talking about, for instance, asymmetry in economic power, the structural kinds of very, very important issues which create huge difficulties in the intent of many of these policies, etc. So even this political economy discourse is something which goes into very different kinds of issues, etc. And to just simplify it, the basic claim was that, look, it depends on a whole lot of structural and conjunctural issues, features, characteristics, whether there would be some gain out of it or no. And if there is some gain, who gains that? Yeah. In particular countries, if you're talking of countries in the South, is there a component which kind of the population which gains out of it, or even that is absent? Right? The gain is elsewhere, right? So there were these debates and discussions which started becoming very prominent. On a personal note, I actually started engaging with these issues roughly about 15 years ago. So I was invited to some conference. By then, I mean, at that time, I had not looked at any of these, this kind of literature, right? But that conference forced me to sort of, get into the literature, both from the perspective of political economy and managerial paradigm, etc., etc. And it started bothering me, quite a lot, that many of the claims which were there, right? So this is one that how it is a win-win for all, coming from the managerial paradigm, which started bothering me a great deal, because by that time, you had the other kind of literature which was showing that, look, there are lots of pitfalls, there are lots of challenges and so on. The second, this fact itself, that, as if here is something new and novel, right? This from the 1960s, that suddenly something new has happened, right? And for a while in the first 3-4 years, I was relatively more comfortable with the idea of production networks, in my own work. My dearest friend actually challenged me, Comrade Paris Yoris, here during one of the summer schools, right? And I said, Comrade, we have to think in a deeper fashion, because there is a history of all these things that we are talking about, right? So much discussion, much debate. I was very easily persuaded by him, because I could see that there's a serious blinker in what I myself was focusing on. So we decided to go back to the notion of global value system. Now, a point which I made earlier, from the beginning, capitalism is a combined and uneven value system. In fact, the beginnings of capitalism coming into being itself, is very profoundly premised on global interconnections. If you want to use well-known Marxian category, external primitive accumulation, right? And if you look at the literature, in fact, going back to Marx, I mean, he tells you that it was these dimensions of external primitive accumulation which accounted for, to use his phrase, the rosy dawn of capitalism. And he talks of loot and plunder in Africa, entombment in the mines in Latin America, hunting for the sort of what he called hunting for the black skins, right, etc. So clearly, this connectedness has been absolutely a central thread, in the way the value has been generated, appropriated, distributed, and so on, right from the word go, right? It's just that the characteristics have changed. At particular junctures, new features have got added, some had kind of receded, and all that. So that was a very important point, which in our conversation, we realized that, the reason for moving towards this global value systems, right? So as Utsa Patnaik was talking the other day, you say industrial revolution, it is cotton. Where did cotton come from, right? Likewise, indigo, some 5 years ago, in Kassel, I mean, not the last one, but the earlier version of that, huge festival that we celebrate in Kassel over a period of 3 months, Smail? Yeah. There was a museum which had 20 shades of blue basically textiles, garments, etc. And every bit of it was basically from or courtesy Global South. It was indigo then, which was used for this entire, all the beautiful fabric and everything that Europe had at that point in time, so much so that Britain had to put a ban on it. Okay, let me not get into all these details. In fact, beginning from, what is sort of the most primitive kind of artisanal arrangement, putting out system. You had these traders getting some raw materials from there, either cotton or yarn or whatever, giving it to one particular artisan, then maybe taking not the finished product, but just the cloth. Then the cloth goes to some other artisan, right? So that is global value system, right? That is your commodity chain, that is your supply chains and so on and so forth. Then that gets, part of it is retained there, substantial part gets exported somewhere, right? So this is nothing new. Even if you call it supply chain or value chain or commodity chain, whatever, there's nothing new about it. It's so this is something which was a very important issue for us. This in terms of framing it. How do we frame it? And then the whole question of gains and losses, etc., etc. You see, if you look at the literature, what you see basically, what emerges very powerfully is something called the smiley curve. Basically, the producers are at the bottom of that curve in terms of what they get out of it, what they gain out of it, and all the nodes in the north. From the point of view of, if you think of sort of more sophisticated arrangements, etc., research, design, XYZ, and so on. Basically, what you describe as the high ends of sort of this entire arrangement in terms of skills, technology, and so on. All that is in terms of backward linkages at the top, and finally, in terms of the forward linkages, again at the top, through huge multinational retail operations. So if you look at, let's say, what does a labor get for a garment which is sold in, sort of labor who has produced it in Bangladesh, Cambodia, India, and so on, out of, let's say, $100 or $1, 2 cents, 3 cents, 5 cents max. The rest of it is going somewhere else. So this is something which, in terms of the outcome, across a whole range of activities, there might be some exceptions where what the Global South as part of this system gets maybe about 10 cents, 15 cents. But in general, you're talking about sort of what they get is in single digit. Okay, lots of literature there and so on and so forth. Okay, so this was the other thing. So in terms of conceptually, how do we frame and under what conditions, what could be the gains, for the labor, for country, and so on and so forth. So we got into those issues. So these were, in a sense, the drivers for the book. And here we thought that we will focus on one particular sector first, agriculture, look at all the 3 continents, look at a number of different scenarios there in terms of crops and the kind of arrangements that they have. So you have basically 3 sections here. One is, concepts and debates. Second is regional trajectories, which is continental trajectories. So in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, so we have some chapters there. And then national experiences. Right? So we sort of at different levels and so on and so forth. In all, as Ruth has already mentioned, 19 chapters. Most of these are co-authored. We very strongly feel that knowledge production is not individual production. It's a social production like any other production. Right? So that is very important. Okay. And so we have a very, very large canvas in terms of what this book contains. And we are immensely grateful, 4 of us as co-editors of this book, to all our authors and the kind of contribution that they made. Very, very substantive. Incidentally, Ismail and Christoph are also here. You know, one of the chapters is right. So that's right. Now, final point, maybe, Ruth, because I want to leave a lot more time for discussion here. What is indeed new about in terms of the contemporary phase of the global value system is indeed the scale of it, the significance of it, because of the technological changes, ICT, communication technology, all these have indeed made these far more prominent compared to, in terms of visibility, etc. And so I'm not saying the share of, let's say, these connectedness in overall global GDP or national GDP was any less in 17th century. No, I'm not making that claim. Okay. So if you simply look at cotton, for instance, and cotton being the king or the queen, in the early days of transition, much of it is coming from outside India, raw materials and so on. I mean, outside Britain and Europe, from countries in the south. So clearly, it was very significant. But the overall sort of nature, structuring of these transactions, etc. And in this context, what we should also note is that there are lots of players who actually are not connected with production at all, but they are very significant in appropriation. Finance capital is at the center of it. BlackRock, is one such company, and the kind of its shapes and structures. Many of these. So, in terms of, you look at UNCTAD, World Bank, ILO, etc., all estimates tell you that the entire stock of internationally traded goods and services today, almost 80% is coming from these global connectedness, right? ILO tells you that if you look at the number of workers who are part of these globally connected nodes, 400 million out of approximately 3 billion or so. So really, in terms of, the scale, etc., some very significant changes have happened. Somebody needs to do very careful historical research to compare what was the situation in 17th century, 18th century, and today, and then we can say something more definitive, right? Very, very sort of last point in this context, connectedness has also seen something very significant, which is, basically lot of direct involvement in two different ways of the North, of capital in the North, for capital in the North, this kind of direct involvement in the South. One route there is what is known as FDIs, direct investments and so on, foreign direct investment. So suddenly, Detroit becomes a rust belt in 1970s and 80s. Or, it used to be known as the automobile capital of the world, right? What happens? Lock, stock, and barrel. You sort of abandon Detroit. Where do they go? East Asia, most of them. But then in other parts of the world, India was also partly a beneficiary, etc., etc. So we saw. The other is, you do not invest a penny, but you incorporate the domestic suppliers, which is what is happening to Bangladesh, which is what is happening to Cambodia in the textile sector, for instance. Right? So basically, you sort of, so that's why you talk of buyer-driven, supplier-driven, these things which are part of this discussion of supply chain kind of literature, value chain literature, and so on and so forth. I don't have time to get into these details, but essentially, the question to ask is, why did this happen? A number of factors explain it. Very simplistic kind of explanation. Stephen Roach, he was Morgan Stanley economist, chief economist. His thing was, this is labor arbitrage. Right? True. Yes, there's a difference. A lot of Marxist scholarship also emphasizes that much more than anything else, right? So the cost of producing something here is, let's say, $1. There it is 3 cents, 5 cents, right? Given the changes in forces of production, technology, communication, etc., it has become very easy now to simply shift it from here to there, get it from there to here, right? So because of these, our argument is that we have to go beyond labor arbitrage. We have to look at nature, regulation, and labor arbitrage. Nature is much cheaper there. you treat it as dirt, right? Europe, you find that suddenly within a decade or so, garment industry is completely shifted to the global south, right? Incidentally, Lawrence Summers, some of you must have heard his name. He used to be Harvard's president, a very well-known neoclassical economist. He had done a secret paper for World Bank, right, which got leaked, and then it was taken off the website also. For a while it was put there, which said all polluting industries should be shifted to the south because the opportunity cost of life there is so low, is dirt cheap. Human beings there don't matter. Shift it, right? So that's why, in our work, and the conceptual paper here in this book by Paris and me, Paris and I, we talk about some of these things. There are many other factors which are part of the story, why the shift happened and so on and so forth, right? So in terms of consequences, we are deeply, deeply pessimistic about gains for the South, in particular workers, etc. And then, the social geography at the is something which is absolutely central to economic geography. So as Susan George once asked a rhetorical question, can you think of somebody poorer than the poorest man? And then she answered rhetorically, his wife, right? So yes, indeed, there is that question of race, many of the things that we have been debating, discussing, etc. You will find all this also in this kind of discourse and studies, findings, etc. So we need to, because it is integral to the global capitalism, right? So in terms of the question that Ruth had asked, economic upgrading, these are very, very tricky things. Economists do a lot of econometrics and try and give you some nonsense, right? But conceptually, it's a very slippery terrain. Yeah, you actually have to define the time period. Is it 10 days, 10 years, 10 months in which you're talking of economic upgrading, right? What would be the indicators, etc.? I don't have time to get into that right now. But yes, what I would like to close with is just the closing sentence from Kate Meagher's chapter here, which is very provocative sentence. Okay, yes, 68. So she concludes basically he's talking about workers in these value system. He chooses value chain. And incidentally, in this, for our authors, we had said, please, we have given you a point of view, but you decide how you want to go about. If you want to still call it value chain, please feel free. That's so informal workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your value chains. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Very apt concluding thought. So let's throw it open. Sorry. And let me just quickly. So Rama, are you able to unmute?
Yes.
Hi, Rama.
Me. Hi, Ruth. Nice to see you.
Lovely to see you. So please, will you jump in with your comments? And we're hoping to still have 10 to 15 minutes at the end for everyone else.
Thank you so much. So I have 10 minutes or 15 minutes?
Can we keep it to 10?
10, okay. Thank you so much. So I wanted to thank the organizers for inviting me to comment on these two very important books. As I was reading, I was taking notes. I have so many pages of notes. I don't know where to start. But I think all of you in the room are so lucky to be facing the authors of this book. I'm so jealous. So let me start by just maybe summarizing and sharing what I think are some of the most important merits of these two books. So I think there is always a trade-off when you want to focus on depth or focus on the breadth of cases, for instance. But in these two books, what we have is that the focus on the global south in both books offers the focus on the depth. So we have varieties of countries, case studies, ranging from regional trajectories. So the African continent, Asia, and America. We also have the fact that the comparative framework that the books use offer the breadth that might have been missing. So the cross-country case studies, as well as the cross-crop case studies. So for instance, in Kara Tepe's book, they're focusing on a staple, focusing on stimulants, and also focusing on mango, so the fresh fruit and vegetable sector. So I think it's really, really important to have this these perspectives. I also find that the cross-disciplinary perspectives that the books use, whether it is perspective from geography, development studies, economics, also enriches, and other disciplines, and enriches both the depth and the breadth. So my second general comment would be on another thing that I find the books do well, which is connecting issues and themes that are often not analyzed together. So when you look at Kara Tepe's book, when he focuses on global, what is in there to gain for smallholder farmers, I think when you look at the issues of social upgrading, so labor, decent work, and looking also at the role of the state, looking at power differentials, power asymmetries within the system, I think these themes connect us to agrarian change in reality. And these are not the issue of agrarian change is most of the time left out of analysis of global value chains. As Praveen has reminded us, we have this paradigm of win-win. We focus on the internal governance of global value chains. We look at upgrading, economic upgrading mostly, but we fail to connect it with the local agrarian transformations that are taking place. So I think this is really significant. And another thing that is important is the policy implications that the book raises regarding the future of work. Both books actually remind us of these issues. And I will now focus on one book at a time. I find that Praveen and Walter Perry's and Freedom's book is certainly a continuation of this book. Because there is a question that you asked, and there is also some issues that you raised in chapter 2 when you were trying to define the contours of how neoliberalism shaped the contours of the world of work. And I find that you start that analysis in the 1970s, and with this book you start analyzing what the implications are in global value chains, looking at the conceptual debates, looking at, in the second part, at the regional trajectories, and in the final part at the national trajectories. So I think it is a very good continuation of this important work. Sorry, I'm just trying to rearrange my notes. And I certainly appreciate the fact that you do not want to use the concept of global production networks. The concept of global value systems, in my opinion, is really important, especially when we're trying to look at how powerful transnational corporations are reaping major advantage by exploiting wage hierarchies, but also by looking at the transnationalization of capital for agricultural production in the global south. So you look at the connected questions of the mobility of capital, defining global agricultural value systems as arrangements involving a set of actors linked in a sequence of activities which add value in supplying a product from its raw materials stage to the final consumer. So I think definitions are important. And this conceptual framework certainly adds something new to the current stage of the literature. And you're also looking at how the agrarian crisis is the material manifestation of the agrarian crisis, from the suicide of the farmers, the death of migrants, sexual exploitation, etc., which are questions that are most of the time not analyzed. And I think the question of value capture and the question of value siphoning that Kojo Amano, for instance, in his chapter analyzes is extremely important. How we are focusing on dispossession as dispossession of capital, but we are failing to look at how dispossession of land, for instance, happens through bankruptcy or distressed sales. So I think this is really extremely important when we look at outsourcing value, outsourcing as value capture and siphoning of value. So these are really new theoretical perspectives that are certainly important. And as you have rightly said, the win-win perspectives that are dominant in the current global production, global agriculture, global value chain, global supply chain analysis fail to really repoliticize issues of labor, issues of decent work, but also issues of social reproduction, in my opinion. And it is something that I was looking for in both books, how those global agricultural value chains are also extracting value from and basing their legitimacy on global patriarchal systems. So it is something that really I didn't I wanted to ask you about. What are your thoughts on that? You certainly did comment on the connected issues of caste, race, gender, but how in practice this connects to the broader issues of global agricultural value systems is an important one to me. And then you rightly said that the win-win literature is interested in how to be more incorporated into these global value chains. And I think Ruth did comment on that, and I really like her comment. I don't know where I put it, but they are not focusing on the terms of the incorporation. And this is the question, the political question that you bring back to the fore by using the Marxian political economy. And that's something that you share with Karatepe's book when he's asking who wins, who captures the value, and how the small holders fail to benefit from these gains. And now I'll just summarize a little bit the book by Karatepe. I really like the breadth of cases from Brazil, Bangladesh, Colombia, Germany, India, Pakistan, and Vietnam, focus on different staple stimulants, and also mango as a crop, and the different disciplines. I also like the analysis in terms of social differentiation, how large-scale farmers in different countries benefit or fail to benefit from the question of global value chains. And I think the book says that its focus is economic and social upgrading, but I think you also touch on the question of economic and social downgrading, even if you don't say so, because the opposite of not benefiting or not attaining the expected gains is certainly downgrading. So I was interested in both books. I wanted to know, I have many questions, and I'm touching on the questions now. What do you think, and to what extent do you think that, or do you agree with Ben Selwyn's comment that global value chains are in fact global poverty chains? In the finding of your book, you are highlighting the role of collective action in order to change the labor regulation, whether we talk about sectoral labor market, or national labor markets. But I wanted to ask you about collaborative action, not collective action. What I mean is, in the case of BlackRock that Praveen just mentioned, we have seen national but also global alliances between NGOs, trade unions, etc., to advance campaigns against those transnational corporations. So I want you to know, to what extent do you think that such collaborative contestations of labor conditions or partnerships, private partnerships, hold a future to social upgrading? I'm in particular talking from a feminist point of view. We have this plan of having a feminist binding treaty. So what do you think that can bring about, especially some, like, I think Stephanie Barrientos have talked about the role of social auditing, but that's specifically in the case of gender. But in general, what do you think, what role do you think can collaborative action play? I wanted also to ask about the role of e-commerce and automation. Yes, the role of e-commerce and automation, the role of the implications of the digitalization of capitalism. And I will also ask the question of social reproduction. So the not only expanded social reproduction that Praveen has talked about, but the role of societal social reproduction. So these are questions that the feminist in me wanted to ask. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Rama. The feminist is not just in you, it is all. It is all of you. Let's throw it open, and I'm going to ask, for the benefit of the people online, everyone in the room who would like to comment or say something, could you please just come around here right now? So that there's no lost time as we queue up to give our inputs. So Praveen, maybe it'll be maybe it'll be quickest if we just have one person after another. Keeping fairly short, and then we give you each one further bite.
So after all the questions, etc., SMAIAS can begin.
Could we also get an indication of those online who would like to say something? I'll read out one while Paris comes over. Simon Munda says, very insightful conversation. I wonder what the speakers think the COVID pandemic taught us about value chain incorporation. Does incorporation make any difference? So does incorporation make any difference is the question. What do we learn from the COVID pandemic? Paris, you're also a co-editor. Please go ahead. And can we keep it short, because we're going to have to try and get a few more responses.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Rama, for taking the time to comment and consider our work over time. You've been part of this network for so long. Good to see you, Rama. And
good to see you too, Paris.
Yes. Okay, I will just add quickly. I don't want to take too much time. Just some of the context that can fill out a bit this why we opted for this change. I think Praveen elaborated beautifully on the long-term debates that have been accumulated in our network. It's worth just filling it out a bit, because we reached this point of wanting to change the terminology, because we accumulated a certain perspective which was not fitting into any longer into this chains business. Now, the chains terminology, you can add to it exploitation chains. They're doing it, and there's research being done on the term exploitation chains, which is very good. I mean, it's actually very close to what we do. But we feel that unless you move the terminology, you don't really make that break. You don't have the impact that you want to have. So in our network, it's just there's a lot of work coming out now in contract farming. You mentioned the agrarian change in 2022, January 2022. In our case, we had a double special issue in 2019, yeah, which was the result of a summer school on agrarian labor in 2014. So this goes a long way, yeah. And which then built up with the FAO project that we had in the following years, and with the collaborations with Ismail and Christoph Scherer in Castle, we kind of gained, it became a snowball. So, but we also had in 2012, yeah, our perspective from the beginning was not a change thing. It was on primitive accumulation. It was on the new tendencies and in this phase of capital accumulation, which was very much in an aggressive primitive accumulation mode. So we did a book in 2012. We did a conference, a summer school on the scramble for land. Yeah. In 2014, agrarian labor. In 2017, labor question. Yeah. In 2016, gender. Yeah. So all this started, and these became special issues, became double special issues in the case of labor and a case of contract farming, and they became books. So we have the labor book, which is a big book in 2021. This one in 2022. We have the gender book coming out next year. So, and the scramble book in 2019. So we reached this point where nothing of this, the change thing was not fitting in. Yeah. And Ismail mentioned, the change approach makes possible to see how the distribution takes place. But it also has certain limits when we put it into a systemic value transfer perspective. Yeah. So we discovered, we felt that the change was not taking into account the labor. Yeah. Because even in the farming, there's paid labor and there's a lot of unpaid labor. Yeah. Yeah. And that unpaid labor establishes the conditions for when you outsource social reproduction to the family and to women in particular, that establishes the conditions for a higher rate of exploitation where the production takes place. So there's a lot of value transfer that happens, but it's not getting captured in measuring what the benefits are to managers, owners, intermediaries, and so forth, the farmers. It's not captured in terms of the monetary value, the prices. Yeah. So there's paid labor, unpaid labor. There's the banks. Where's the banks in the chain? You see, there's a lot of credit. It's a heavily financialized system. So that doesn't get, so when you put all this, it just doesn't fit anymore. Yeah, we just need to and in fact, the value systems approach is starting to get, at least in with our students, I have a student that's working on mining in Brazil, iron ore. Yeah, and he's adopting the value systems perspective. So I mean, because it makes viable a broader research perspective. Anyway, so that's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Paris. Great. Other people from the room. Duha, was that a question?
No, I was scratching my head. Sorry.
Okay, so head scratching happening here.
No, I'm scratching in agreement.
I'm going to really encourage, though, anyone who wants to ask a question. I mean, this has been quite provocative. It doesn't look like you have it all neatly tied up with bows and this is now all agreed. It's actually quite a lot of this is open-ended. And I suppose 2 broad questions suggest themselves. What are the implications of your book? Politically and programmatically, I mean, for a political project, what are the implications? Are they in any way different to what you would have said at the outset of this project? Yeah, you might have had some thoughts, and to the extent that you feel that there are gaps, it sounds like issues around the articulation of smallholder production under contract and unpaid labor and social reproduction dynamics may be something to look at further. But also, and I was struck, Rama, by your comment about Kojo's point relating to how this carries on into commodification of land, right? through distress sales. So there's a connection again through the value chain system, through labor, through the squeezing of necessary reproduction, and into labor commodification and concentration. So it seems to me that it also begs further questions. So that's what I'm provoking you all. Yeah, come, Bosman. And then let's have 3 minutes or 4 minutes, whatever you like, in whichever order again that you like.
There's nobody online, no?
There was just that one question that I saw. I don't know if anyone is monitoring a Facebook live stream, but for now, those of you online, if you would like to ask a question, put your comment or question in the Q&A. If you would like to speak, you can request to be given speaking rights as a participant, in which case we can upgrade you to a panelist. Okay, here's Bosman to ask a question.
Thank you. I'm provoked by you, actually, and also by, I think, by Praveen. And for me, these presentations, they are really different.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know what happened, because Ismail mentioned the project started from this room also, but I think they are completely different, and I actually would like to hear more explicit terminology, because I think we have people like Intan Swandi, value chain as new economic imperialism. I don't hear that yet, so I would like to hear more explicit, either from Praveen or Ismail.
Okay. Okay, great. Anyone else? Yeah, Boa. Boa Manjane will make a comment or question. Women.
This is maybe a bit provocative question to the editors of this book. What's your thinking about the ideas that agrarian movements are putting on the table about localizing food systems, and sort of the link, to use Samira concept from what you call global value systems, in order to maybe gain more control, for peasants and workers to gain more control over what they produce, but also to control the processes of production more, right? And be more autonomous from from the capitalists that accumulate on the whole system. Thanks.
Great. I think that's enough to chew on. Ismail, would you like to go first again?
Yeah,
and we'll finish with Praveen.
Okay. Let me start with the technical question in order to also spend more time to think about the more complicated questions. The project was funded by Hans Böckler Foundation as a trade union foundation, and FAO, and as well as International Center of Development and Decent Work. So we have different sources to finance our field works. And the question is, another question is the definition of economic upgrading. Praveen is right. Economic upgrading refers to a process by which producers obtain more gain generated across the chain. So it refers to a process, and in this book we just try to highlight not only economic upgrading but also economic downgrading, or the absence of upgrading. That's why we choose the title as Fountain of Upgrading, because there is not such a thing, at least as far as we found. And another question concerning the economic gain for the farmers, for the farmer workers and the smallholders. We of course look at the gate prices. So this is our starting point, you know, what they gain. That's why actually we choose, I'm moving to other question. That's why we choose the question, we choose very pragmatically the concept value chain, because then it allows us to see, you know, a little bit breakdown, who gets what, and middleman, landowner, if it's a we'll also touch upon a little bit the credit relations. So it allows us a little bit break down the benefits distributed across the chain. So it's rather a pragmatic perspective rather than an intellectual choice. Paris is quite right about it. He points out finance is missing. But what is missing is, in the value chain analysis, is the politics. It's actually much more crucial. And then politics is completely missing. That's why we try to underline the importance of the politics. We didn't actually then distinguish collaborative from the collective action. Actually, we use collective action as an overarching term in order to grasp all sort of cooperation and solidarity. In order to a little bit increase the bargaining power of smallholders and farm workers. And again, finance is missing, politics is missing, and most importantly, this is something that I would like to also highlight in this presentation, state is missing. National state is the most important instrument to reduce decent work deficits. Still, state is a set of institutions that can, I'm talking about national states, that can enforce national laws. So then in value chain analysis, it is also missing. And then, I mean, that's why its role should be rather brought to the forward. And of course, state in the literature, in value chain analysis literature, is regarded as an actor. But from a historical materials point of view, state cannot be regarded as an actor. State can be pursued as a set of institutions in and through which actor can exercise the power. That means we have to then bring again the social forces and social classes we should bring them into the analysis in order to understand the upgrading processes. And then they are all missing in the value chain perspective. And just to sum up, there is one great question. It's why didn't you look at flex crops? It's a good damn question. I don't know the answer. You know, we never thought about it, and nobody actually raised this question. So if somebody had raised this question, we would definitely think about it. But then this is something that we completely oversee. You are quite right. That's I mean, some of our friends actually have done great work on it, but we somehow miss it. And the very last point about social reproduction. This is well, if a social scientist would like to answer a question, he or she will say context matters. You know, it's the best way to escape from the question. And, you know, it's or answering the question like, oh, it depends on the case to case. But what is really interesting to observe in the field research is that context really matters. Because in certain case studies, we have found more, for instance, movement or household involvement than the others, especially in Ghana. I don't know whether it's a case that is familiar to you, but household is the one actually who organizes the trade. So most of the middlemen are women, and so on. So then each and every case study then requires more detailed analysis to understand the role of women and the role of women, and then also the role of the unpaid household in the production and the distribution of agricultural produce. I said it depends because, I mean, the terminology that I use, it also depends on the context. We are talking about the smallholders, but then in Brazilian case, a small farm is regarded as less than 20 hectares. At least it's what I heard. But FAO say it should be less than 2 hectares in order to label a small farm. And then, of course, the involvement of the household depends on size. Also, the distribution of task in the production and the production of the crop. Yeah, too much, right? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ismail. Okay, great. Thanks so much. Praveen, over to you to bring this session.
No.
We will address it at the end. Over to you,
Okay, sorry. Okay.
Praveen.
Fine, thank you. So, Rama, you made some important points pertaining to what has been achieved here and what is missing. So, in particular, the issue of social reproduction. Yes, indeed. Now, we have not gone into as much detail. You see, I mean, each author had her or his own sort of set of concerns that was being reflected upon. No remit was given to anyone. Yeah. Of course, we missed on 1 or 2 papers which was supposed to be focusing a lot more on it in this book. Yeah. Issues of social reproduction and so on. But that's the accident of any sort of edited volume and so on. So you make but your point is well taken. Surely, in our work, we have been acutely aware of putting that very much on the canvas of our understanding in a serious manner. And hopefully we'll do more so as not to disappoint you in our future efforts. Collaborative action and sort of collective action, etc. Some of this, so for instance, if you look at the last chapter, which is sort of communal production of coffee. This is in Mexico, and basically the experience of the Zapatista movement, yeah, which is being discussed there by Elizabeth and Olaf. Yeah. So that gets into those issues in a serious manner, reasonably serious manner, I would say. Issues of structure and conditions which are more policy driven and so on, combinations of Zimbabwe papers are a very good example of that. Walter, Freedom and so on, they have gone into sort of very careful analysis of under what conditions you can expect a somewhat better deal for smallholders and etc. etc. So bringing the state back and so on. So yes, a lot more can be done, could have been done, will be done, right? In our continuing work on, because this is not sort of a one-shot kind of thing. The issues which we get into remain with us as researchers. Yeah, Bosman, you see, in fact, we note this paper by Sugandhi, Jonah, and Foster on page 9 of our chapter. And in fact, there I also quote something which I had written almost a decade ago, which is, in short, adequate recognition of different social, political, and economic features constituting structures and regimes of accumulation need to be engaged with. Right. This is the thrust of our political economy understanding, and why we want to frame it as global, regional, local, whatever value system. Okay, so if you be sort of Suvandi, etc., the problem is there is too much emphasis on just one dimension by and large. Yeah, the subsequent work is the kind of things that I was referring to. This whole regulation and nature arbitrage. Okay, so if you look at their early contributions and so on, and remember that this basically we have I mean, this for this particular book, basically we stop around 2019, 2020 in terms of the available material, yeah, whether done by others or our own works. So that's why there's nothing about COVID here, even though the book is published in, now that, of course, changes many things in dramatic ways, right? So we need to engage with those issues also in a fuller fashion. Yes, Boa, your point. I mean, you have, I take it you have heard me on this on several occasions. See, I am completely opposed to, the strand of thinking within progressive scholarship which says for a better globalization, ILO. For me, the starting point is indeed, I mean, Samir Amin had put it very clearly, but there are a number of scholars, the Patnaiks in India, yeah, and many others. Let me not take many names for lack of time, but there has been a huge literature for almost 40 years now, that the concerns which are emerging. Okay, so it is extremely important to have that policy autonomy. It does not settle the whole question, So, for instance, debate between food sovereignty versus food security and under what conditions, and so there are lots of those issues which need to be fleshed out. I'm not running away from any of that. We are not running away from those issues. But the starting point has to be an understanding that if we indeed want a better outcome for working people, masses in general, then this does not work, right? So 2004 report of global, ILO is a disaster. It just touches on the surface and so on and so forth, right? And finally, in our understanding of value system, Ismail, of course, politics is at the center, right? So as I said, quoting one of my earlier pieces, that all this, so state is at the center. We have to integrate all that in our understanding of what kind of value system do we have. I mean, if you ask me, and I have said this again umpteen number of times, single most powerful economic actor in the world for the last roughly 40 years is finance capital, right? Without integrating that into our understanding of how the world functions, you're not going to get anywhere. Right? So there are all these things which, of course, so thanks very much for all your very well thought considerations, inputs, etc. And incidentally, one of the handbook which should be out very soon, and the editor of that handbook insisted that I write a paper, and I had proposed that we will do it together, Paris and myself, global exploitation chains.
Oh,
right? So,
okay.
So we were told that, okay, use this. I said, look, I don't feel very happy with the title which you're proposing, but I'll do it because I understand what you're trying to get at. Yeah. So, Rama, so global poverty chains, exploitation chains, etc. There are all kinds of terms which are floating in the air, right? But I think if we are given that option, we would stick to global value systems. We make a distinction between different phases of the global value system, and that is why we have called it contemporary global value systems, which we frame from roughly 1960s, 70s, yeah, when that regulated regime came under huge assault, right? Lyndon Johnson once famously said that we are all Keynesians now, right? 1966, 67. What nonsense. Okay. So as I keep saying that there is a variety in even, neoliberalism, like varieties of capitalism. So Germany is different from somebody else, and so on and so forth. Let me just stop there. Thank you. Thank you for your.
Thank you.
Yes.
And just to say, I'm sure echoing us all online, Rama has said congratulations on these important books, Praveen, Walter, Freedom, and Paris, and also Ismail. I've integrated them in our reading lists. So great. It's coming out now and the term is only starting. So I'm sure we all feel the same. Thank you very much. I'm afraid we've squeezed tea. Please come back soon.
Thank you.